Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very learned and knowledgeable academic, researcher from the UK, but speaking to us from Budapest today, Mr. David Martin Jones. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
David is the Director of Research of the Danube Institute in Budapest. He's a visiting professor of war studies at King's College, University of London. And he's an author. And all of you know, I am very partial to authors. He's an author of several books, and I'm going to read out some of them. History's Fools, The Pursuit of Idealism and the Revenge of Politics, The Strategy of Maoism in the West, Toward Illiberal Democracy in Pacific Asia, Political Development Pacific Asia, Conscience and Allegiance in 17th Century, The Image of China in Western Social and Political Thought. So David, you are a China guru or a China expert, and I thought today we'll speak about China and Asia to you. Let me start by asking you, when did you first become interested in China?
Well, my interest in China began when I left the London School of Economics after getting my PhD there and not being able to find a job anywhere in the UK in the 80s and being advised to try Singapore, where the director of the LSE, Michael Leifer, had a long-term association. So I basically went to Singapore to teach political thought and realized very quickly that there was a very significant Asian culture that, because of my Eurocentric background, I was aware of, but hadn't really understood the depth of the cultural understandings, both, in India, but also in China. So Singapore being dominated by a, Chinese, overseas Chinese community and Singapore being increasingly interested in an opening up of China and trading with it after the Maoist era. It was a very exciting time to look at Chinese thought and Chinese development practice. So my Chinese awareness was based on overseas China.
Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. So, I have been visiting China since 1989, and I must have been there about 50 or 60 times. But I wanted to ask you, the different leaders of China, starting with, say, Deng Xiaoping believed in growth with folded hands. Xi Jinping believes in the checkbook diplomacy. How do you see the differences or similarities in the opening of China under Deng and Xi?
Well, as you know, and you've obviously been to China a lot more than I have. Deng's pragmatism was based on the understanding that the Maoist era, Maoist economic policies and its cultural revolutionary policies had actually been utterly disastrous. And although, formally he couldn't say that, Deng made the strategic decision to open up areas for foreign investment and encourage foreign investment. And the consequences were astonishing, really. So, places like Shenzhen went from being, muddy sort of coastal areas with no employment into a kind of megalopolis of about 30 million people within 20 years. So Deng's policy was very much to open China to foreign direct investment, which was the basis then of its growth. By the time you get to Xi, you've got a far more developed China with its own capacity to develop, competitive, particularly tech competitors with Western alternatives. So, the story of Huawei in this context becomes, an emblematic story, if you like, because Huawei started in Shenzhen. It was started by a former Red Army engineer. At the time, in the early 80s, China didn't even have, real landlines. It had to take that technology from UK tech companies, and it was, the strategic insight to then make a deal with Hong Kong telcos, Hutchison Whampoa particularly, to develop Huawei, which then becomes, an international brand with a huge footprint, not only, in Asia, but in the UK as well, until, it was cut out after fears of espionage from the UK government. So the structure of the Chinese economy changes dramatically from Deng to Xi in a way that China can now export its models to the world rather than being dependent on overseas technology to get growth developing.
Very interesting. And when you talk of Deng Xiaoping, what did he do differently to power the Chinese economy since 1981? And how is Xi Jinping doing it differently? He seems to be reining it in.
Well, I think the Deng model, as I said, was hugely pragmatic, and it emphasized growth and development of a middle class and growing its own tech and manufacturing industries by being, labor competitive with, Southeast Asia or other East Asia dragon economies. So, I mean, the China model followed very much the East Asian model of the 60s and 70s, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, had all followed that flying geese model that the Japanese talked about. And so Deng was a variation upon that, except, China was a far bigger economy potentially than anywhere else in Asia. And once it reached a certain developmental level, it was able to not only be able to rely on foreign expertise, it had developed its own expertise and could then project its kind of model outward, a China model, which Xi talks about as part of even a China dream, which he announced in 2013. Okay. So there is a sort of relationship between the Deng model and the Xi model, but the Xi model is very much based on a much more powerful economic capacity and an economic model that expands outwards rather than requires inward investment into its own economy.
Well said. And now coming on to Xi Jinping, for a whole, several generations of Chinese were brought up on Mao's Red Book. Now, Xi Jinping is the only other chairman of the party who's got his own little book.
Yes.
Which is now being, seen on every student's table, every teacher's table, etc. I'd love to get your perspective on what are the implications of such kind of indoctrination.
Yeah, well, I mean, the the model is not a very happy one, I would say, if we are aware of, as sort of cultural historians, I suppose, the experience of Mao's Little Red Book was for a generation of Chinese utterly catastrophic. The Cultural Revolution had huge consequences upon China. And also it was one of China's first exports to the left in the West, which in turn has left its own disturbing legacy, as I've written in a recent book on the strategy of Maoism, where China abandoned its assault on its own culture, but those in the West picked up Mao's model, and you can see it translated into the current iconoclastic attacks on everything to do with Western civilization at the moment. So I would have thought that Xi, obviously China is very powerful in a way that it wasn't under Deng, economically powerful and potentially militarily powerful. And it is, has always had a propensity to welcome strong, powerful, almost godlike leaders, which is a tendency in a Chinese civilizational sense to look to the mandate of heaven being transmitted through an imperial figure. So ironically, Xi has picked, as Mao did, has picked up on this traditional view of power and now tries to promote himself and the party as almost omnipotent in its self-understanding. This is potentially very dangerous, as the Mao example would indicate.
Well said, well said. And, coming from the perspective of the power of China, I've often wondered that without fighting a single war, China has become a major superpower. Do you think China has become the bully of Asia?
To some extent. I think we've got to be quite careful about what China wants. It's quite clear that, once China emerges, as Napoleon said, once the dragon awakes, it's going to be not only economically, but politically influential, or hugely influential, because of the way in which a country of 3.5 billion people must be, with the territorial area it encompasses. So the very nature of its economic growth means that it will exert its economic and political power regionally. Hence, its expansion post the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s into Southeast Asia and across Eurasia through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So that kind of influence and growth was entirely predictable merely by its economic and developmental weight. Other aspects of Chinese increasing assertiveness take the form of a more bullying behavior, notably in the South China Sea, and sometimes elsewhere as well.
Correct, correct. But given all the work that you've done with China, do you see any chinks in the incredible armor of China?
Yeah, I think, China has, if you look back, as you will know, to the Deng era, there was the Tiananmen event of 1989, which taught the party, it derived a key lesson from it, that you open up the economy, but you maintain the levers of power on politics. Now, there was a generation of thinkers post 1990, post Francis Fukuyama's End of History, that assumed that although China might restrict democratic aspiration, the mere fact that it had a growing middle class of about 80 million people by the second decade of the 21st century, this would inevitably promote a desire for more democracy, more autonomy, more liberalization. And the problem is the party won't recognize that aspiration, which is still there, I would argue, amongst the more educated elements of urban Chinese society. So there is an increasing insistence under Xi for following the leadership, following the party, and not dissenting. And even businessmen who've been very successful, like the Alibaba founder, or Hong Kong entrepreneurs like the Apple Daily founder, as soon as they can fall foul of the regime with quite brutal consequences, really. And ultimately, this will not sustain an economically successful superpower. I mean, history shows really that such autocracies, while looking powerful, can be internally divided, and its strictness could presage, collapse at some point. I mean, the last couple of years, they've not been great for democracy, but they haven't been so good for autocracies either.
Correct. Well said. The other question I had from you, David, was that China seems to have opened up flanks with every single country it shares a border, including those it shares a water border with. And I was last reading that they've even claimed Vladivostok from Russia.
Right. Yes.
So what in your opinion is the reason it's opening up so many flanks?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, obviously, I think the understanding behind Xi and the China dream is that China lost face dramatically in the century of humiliation, beginning with, of course, the Opium Wars, and then the series of unequal treaties that cut China to pieces in some ways, internally and with its external relations. So the dream of the Communist Party, although socialist, has also been, deeply nationalist as well. And part of that nationalist agenda is to return China to its historic role as Zhongguo, the central kingdom.
Correct.
And that means to reestablish its control of its Ming periphery. And so the South China Sea in that style of thinking is merely a Chinese lake, and the Nanyang, Southeast Asia, is essentially a tributary set of arrangements. Japan has always been a problem historically. The Koreas had always been part of the Ming, Tang imperial Sung understanding, merely extensions of the imperial model of China. And then, I think, your question about Vladivostok, I think is pretty crucial in the current geopolitical context, because we're all focused on Ukraine in Budapest. But people are not paying attention to the fact that much of Russia Asian Russia is east of the Urals.
Correct.
Now, when was that ceded to Russia? Well, after the Franco-Anglo-French War against Beijing in the 1860s, in which there was further unequal treaties, and China was opened up not only to Anglo-French influence, but German and particularly Russian. And there was a Russian Qing Treaty signed in 1865, the Peking Treaty, which ceded that area north of Mongolia to Russia in perpetuity. And what we know about that area, which was the source of a border war between Russia and China, or the Soviet Union and China in 1962, is that China has always thought of that part of Pacific Russia as Chinese. And the problem for Russia currently is that most of its population is west of the Urals. East of the Urals, Russia is hugely underpopulated. There are more Chinese probably in that area than there are Russians at the moment, and they're the ones trading there. And as we know, feet on the ground can soon become lines on the map. So it's probably more interesting geopolitically, rather than sort of obsessing about the South China Sea, to look at China's strategic intentions towards Pacific Asia.
That's an amazing perspective. Thank you. I'd like to now move to Taiwan. There's this constant saber rattling that's going on. And of course, America keeps saying nothing can happen. But I'd love to get your perspective on where do you think, other than, of course, this constant comment that the two countries, one country, two systems, and we will reunify. Where do you think the Taiwan challenge will go to?
Well, it's obviously hard to speculate, given the amount of saber rattling that's going on. I think there are two aspects to it. One is the Taiwan economy, as you know, is hugely locked in to Fujian province. So its manufacturing capacity requires on labor in Fujian to promote its brands globally. And both in chemical manufacturing, iPhones, etc. It's all the Taiwan Fujian, kind of linkage is critical to Taiwan. So, in a way, Taiwan and China are already integrated as an economy. The problem is, of course, that the Taiwanese do not want to become part of mainland China. They still want their own relative autonomy, even though the Kuomintang, the KMT, have much closer relationships with mainland China than the Democrats in Taiwan, and Taiwan is a democracy, unlike mainland China, and this is part of the problem, part of the dilemma. It seems to me, despite all the saber rattling, that it would be disastrous for both China and Taiwan to go to war. China wants to overawe Taiwan into just folding up and saying, okay, we want to be part of Greater China. But it would be far better doing that by persuasion rather than threats. Given what's happened in Ukraine recently with Russia, I would have thought the more sensible, pragmatic people in the party or in the Red Army would be thinking very carefully about what an invasion of Taiwan would achieve, and it would be far more sensible, really, to avoid confrontation with Taiwan and think about what you could gain by taking Vladivostok.
That's a very interesting perspective we're thinking about. I have time for only one more question, David, and I'm now going to come to a much larger geography. There's this new axis, there's the Quad, there's AUKUS, and all of them purportedly to protect the Pacific Ocean. But people say it's also for China. But then there is this new axis that is being talked about between USA, India, Japan, Australia, and Israel. And I'm told several of the Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam, have expressed interest in being a part of it. Do you think these countries really will be able to control the might of China economically and militarily?
I think it's an interesting prospective arrangement, and it's significantly an Asian arrangement, which China will obviously think of as a containment strategy, and I think it must be making those in Beijing conscious of the fact that they haven't played it, under Deng, the opening up of China and its, its ability to emerge, as you said, as a superpower without conflict, was based on the premise that the Americans and the Southeast Asians under the ASEAN Regional Forum and other devices thought that China could be shaped into good international citizenship. That was the aspiration of the 90s and the first decades of the 21st century. China has kind of blown its image as a responsible emerging great power. And thus it's provoked in some ways this inevitable realist reaction of those who feel threatened, not only the United States, but obviously Australia, even to some extent, Singapore, which always plays a Janus-faced game. But certainly, Indonesia, obviously India, but Japan has been much more abrasive, since Abe. And Abe saw his relationship with India as a key relationship for Japan going forward. And Vietnam is an obvious, kind of long-term victim of what it sees as Chinese, assertiveness. So I think this sort of emerging alliance is something that China would have to think about very closely. But it's a sort of, it's interesting that China's own thinking is probably not so much maritime, but, land-centered. It's pushing into Central Asia and into Pacific Russia, which it sees as its increasingly, it's got an unthreatening capacity to potentially dominate the world island, as H.L. Mackinder described it.
Well said. And on that note, David, we've run out of time. I can keep speaking to you for hours, given the kind of knowledge you have. But thank you so much for talking to me about China. I think I've learned many, many new things from you today. Thank you for speaking to me about Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping. Thank you for talking to me about China, the economy, and some of the opportunities and the threats that it could potentially represent for Asian countries and maybe the world in general. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.